Welcome back to the CannMed Coffee Talk Lounge here at CannMed 2022. I'm here with Afia, Lab Director of Cannasafe.
Chief Science Officer.
Oh, I am sorry. Chief Science Officer, Afia. Thank you for correcting me.
No problem.
Good to see you, Ini.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to be back at an in-person event, no?
Oh, it's fantastic. I'm glad you were able to make this happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now, in your opinion, what's the main value that you get out of coming to conferences like CannMed?
Honestly, the networking is invaluable. Just the ability to socialize, given what's happened in the last couple of years, just the ability to socialize with folks, that's invaluable. But for me, it's about the tidbits of new information that you always learn. The cannabis plant is so complex that anytime you get to sit with some bright minds and see what they've been doing over the last year or so, in this case, it's been a few years, lots of great research. I'm really excited to really get to learn, especially what we've just been through with the medical practicum.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. You were sitting in on that one?
Yeah, I was sitting on that one, and it is fantastic. I tell you, no matter how much you think you know, even if it's a regurgitation of the same information from previous years, you always find things you've missed previously. Just being able to see research that's done not only on individual cannabinoids, but also on whole plant medicine.
Sure.
It's been fantastic. We're learning more and more about this plant. I think it was Dr. Sulak that spoke about there are a whole new class of compounds that are being found that have to do with tryptophan or so in the cannabis leaves. It's really interesting stuff that you get to learn every time I come here. So.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you say that too, that even if you think you're a cannabis medicine or just a cannabis expert, there are those little tidbits that maybe you didn't pick up on the last time and that you can take away.
Yeah, precisely. It's just like a little bit of relearning. In anything you do, you have to practice, right? So even if you know it, just hearing it again over and over, it starts to stick and you get to understand a little bit more. So I think it helps us all in the industry just grow.
Absolutely. You mentioned the practicum. Any other presentations at CannMed that you're really looking forward to?
Apart from mine, honestly, I see a lot of great info coming out of there. I'm looking forward to hearing what Dr. Muchulam has to offer. Now, he'll have a video presentation. It sounds really interesting with what he's got coming up. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that.
Excellent. So your presentation that you mentioned that we're all looking forward to is about preparing for DCC standardization.
Yeah.
And I know that one of the problems that the DCC is looking to solve with this standardization is lab shopping. Mm-hmm. So I was hoping you could maybe explain what the problem of lab shopping really is and how it kind of negatively affects multiple factors of the industry.
So essentially, lab shopping is when your clientele, or certain clientele, go from lab to lab, either looking for specific results or at least going to be able to compare the results that are being given by different labs and potentially find favorable results and from a certain lab, and they would get testing with that lab for their compliance COA. So this is generally done in R&D. And as we know, California has 40-something or so labs, so there's plenty of options to continually, travel and check labs out until you find your favorable results. Unfortunately, it's one of those situations where it's not positive for anybody. I like to put it in a sense that everybody loses in that case. We talked about how, for one, a consumer loses. Let's say, for instance, you're talking about a potency result. If somebody's shopping for a certain potency result on flower sample, a consumer ends up buying a sort of a potentially inflated result, right? You're paying more for something that's not particularly what you thought it is. So, right, you lose money right there. Even through a distributor to distributor, getting sold that way, if you're paying higher because of a potentially falsely high result, they're losing, they're paying more. All this sort of leads to a slippery slope where regulators lose control. Think about even the labs that do this thing. So labs start to lose in a sense that they are producing this false results. Labs that don't produce this end up, maybe losing revenue, eventually closing down or, laying off employees. In that case, the employees lose, right? Keeps going, employees lose, right? They potentially get on unemployment. State loses, right? We as taxpayers end up paying for this. So it's just a slippery slope of continual losses that there's really no winner in this game.
Yeah. No, and you mentioned that there's a large number of testing labs in California, and there is, I imagine, some pressure of labs to give favorable results in order to, like you said, keep their business open. So yeah, that's a really unfortunate situation.
It's really unfortunate, and there is that high pressure, and it's not easy. I mean, I've faced that pressure myself. You just have to be able to be able to meet your consumers, or I should say your clientele's need, without going into unscrupulous areas.
Sure.
Right? Somehow it's not easy to stay in business, but there are plenty of ways lab can stay in business as they sort of pivot around cannabis testing. There's much more you can do apart from, potentially giving inflated potency results.
Sure. Yeah, and I know that one of those ways that labs can kind of provide more value to their clients is offering more R&D testing, or offering testing services that aren't necessarily on the compliance panel, like virus testing, for example. And I know that you at Cannasafe have been doing that.
Precisely. I mean, we're always looking for what offers more value. Again, this industry, we're only getting to learn a little bit more. There's so much more to learn. We're only learning very tidbit of what it has to offer. So we're offering some value-added services like viral testing, HLVD, beet curly. We're also looking at stability testing, something that folks are not really most folks are not paying attention to, but they should be, because that's coming up as you start to talk about expiry dating. How are you really determining that? Is it per ICH guidelines? So we start to offer some of those value-added services that are undervalued.
Yeah, that's excellent. No, kind of going back to the issue of lab shopping and potency in particular, I got to imagine part of the issue with that too is just this idea that THC values are the determiner of quality. And maybe if that weren't the case, then there wouldn't be so much pressure in getting those high potency numbers.
That's really it. I mean, that's a great point. Where, you go to your dispensary and the first thing you see is usually, you have several shelves and they have the top shelf, and it's really the THC numbers that get highlighted. It's really interesting because the labs do all this work to produce a beautiful COA with all these assays, terpenes and other things, and yet the THC gets highlighted, and nobody, apart from the buyers and sellers, ever really gets to see that COA. It's really meant for the consumer. So there's a lot more in there that I think we need to pay attention to. A lot of, I'm starting to do a lot of work on some other compounds such as flavonoids, we know has some great medicinal effects. Just to push the attention away from THC, I'm starting to see, interestingly, even states starting to put limits on THC. There is state like Mississippi that's coming out with regulations that they're actually limiting their flour to 30%. So essentially, if those regulations stick, when you test a flour that's above 30%, it's an automatic fail.
Wow.
And the interesting thing is they're adding in all the THC, so the variants, the THC Delta 8 and all of the above. So it's something that perhaps maybe it's not such a bad idea.
Yeah, right. Well, especially when you consider that flour testing, especially when you consider that flour is rarely ever higher than 30%.
That's true. You really got to consider what is the capacity, how much THC kind of flour really produce, right? We're talking in terms of percent mass, right? So 30% is really pushing it. And some reason, there are folks that grow 30% flour. I think it gets pushed a little further because we're doing by dry weight, right? The labs are, the regulations state that you should test by dry weight. So when you say it's 30%, and then it's about 12%, 10% moisture, and you add that in, right? It bumps it up to high 30s. Now you're pushing 40, so people can kind of see how, depending on how that moisture content and how that dry weight is added back into the math. Yeah, you start to push those limits. So the real flour percentage really is around maybe mid-20s, but then you end up pushing 30 because of dry weight.
Interesting. No, and that's funny too, when you said that in Mississippi, if you test higher than 30% THC, you might fail.
Right.
So you might have some lab shopping going the other way, right?
It's really interesting because that's what's going to happen. So now, I guess if you grow anything good, relatively good, don't go to Mississippi and sell it. Right, so lab shopping is going to be the opposite way. Now, when you consider that, you'd have to add in all these other THC components. Also, it's not even just flour. The regulations state something about concentrates being limited to 60%. So forget all this 90% vape pens and isolates and whatnot. So it's going to be interesting to see if any other state kind of adopts those sort of regulations, or if those Mississippi regulations actually stick.
Yeah, that is one of the interesting ways. It's one of the interesting outcomes of having multiple states enacting different regulations, right? It's kind of like all these little test kitchens, so we can see how these regulations work.
Yeah, very true, very true. And, it's sort of what exacerbates the condition we're in with the different states having different regulations. So, these multi-state organizations may have producers in certain state, they look for a certain type of result. In another state, they look for another type of result. So there's got to be some kind of congruency in this result. We have to start to be able to standardize some of these things.
Right, so, comes back to standardization, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So in addition to your talk on standardization, you're also participating on a panel discussion that's all about nutrients and the role that they play in yield and cannabinoid output. I'm curious, from the testing lab perspective, do you see a lot of correlation between certain nutrients that are used and sort of the values that you see on your tests?
That's very hard to pinpoint. Great question. We do get client requests to sort of do a nutrient analysis. But what ends up happening is it's hard to say for a fact that it was because of certain nutrient that you are having this certain profile. What we do try to do for some of the nutrient analysis that I'm looking for, you're looking for things like calcium, magnesium, potassium, all of those, is we have to sort of determine a mass balance. So what is your input? And then you're testing the runoff water. What is that? And then you're testing the plant. How much is left in there? And you're trying to do sort of a mass balance. Okay, my plant is uptaking this much and it's wasting this much, or this much is going to the runoff. And see at what stages is it uptaking certain nutrients, or is it just being, washed off essentially. But it's been quite difficult to exactly say, because you use a certain nutrient mixture, that your terpenes were greater. Certainly there's an effect, but I think more research has to be done. It's definitely an effect on using high quality nutrients and the right proportion of nutrients at the certain growth stages. That's something you have to consider, that it's not the same throughout. It's not a pre-mixed nu that you carry throughout the process. But it's really interesting to note that, yes, something I meant to say was that when we talk about nutrients, not just the beneficial ones. So things like metals, if they happen to be in the nutrients, the plants holds onto it.
Sure.
What I found is that it's really cultivar dependent. A lot of people do flushes at the end, but we found that certain cultivars, like for instance cadmium, will hold onto that a little bit more. So if the same nutrients that unfortunately contain cadmium was fed to your entire grow, different cultivars, you'll find that there's varying levels of cadmium, some passing and some failing the regulatory limit once you do your final COA, just because of how the plant actually holds on to that. We know these plants as bioaccumulators, but they can be released, but the residual levels are different per certain cultivars.
Yeah, that's interesting. No, and it's interesting. It echoes the idea of the entourage effect, right? Like you have multiple nutrients that are kind of having the synergistic effect to help your plant.
Most certainly. I think it plays throughout the whole cannabis industry, I should say.
Yeah, really, yeah. And even here at CannMed, it takes all of us from all the different disciplines, from the scientific directors here into the medical professionals, to all come together to better understand this plant.
That's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of it, covering all facets. The clinicians are learning from the analytical chemistry. We're learning from the clinicians, and it's all being tied together. I mean, I don't think any of our work can be separated in that sense. We sort of have to work together, because whether you like it or not, the results are always tied together. So, I like to say this, but somebody always said all boats rise in the tide, and that's always clear in this industry. All
right, I think it's a great place to stop. Yeah. So, thanks again, Ini, Chief Scientific Officer of Cannasafe. I got it right this time.
Thank you.
And thanks again to our sponsors, Medicine Women Health and the Hemp Coffee Exchange.